Hello, welcome to CDR Policy Scoop, Injy. Great to see you.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks for being here. Excited for this conversation. I know that Ev in particular has been wanting to talk about this topic in depth for a while, the topic being residual emissions. And so, yeah, excited. Ev, do you want to kick us off?
I guess so, indeed. I am excited. I've written about this topic before. I always feel like it's something like luring in the background and popping up every now and then. But I felt like when I saw the report that we're going to cover today, that you are one of the co-authors of, Injy, and it's titled What Are Residual Emissions, which is a perfect title. I really felt like this is exactly what I want to cover. It goes deep on this, and it provides a lot of much needed clarity, I think. So, Injy, why don't you kick us off by just telling us, like, how come we still don't know in terms of having one definition on what are residual emissions, and is that a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting because I think often with these terms that are so ubiquitous, we just, hear it all the time. We do just assume that there could be some standard definition out there. And also that how the term has originated has also done so in a kind of homogenized way. Often we think, we look to the IPCC and whatnot for these kinds of terms and really do take them as a given. And so this project really was born out of this realization that while everyone is unified on the language in terms of residual emissions, that actually there's very little consistency with how it's used, what it means. And actually, that means much more than just defining actually what residual emissions are, but really does impact the journeys towards net zero, for instance, carbon removal, procurement, and whatnot. So I think it really is an issue that we're not actually unified about how we define residual emissions. And really, we're only at the precipice of understanding what that means in practice in a lot of sectors. And that is where the nitty-gritty really hits the road and where it really matters to get it right as well.
If I can ask again, why is that? Because, it sounds like the term was introduced more than 10 years ago, right? And in other areas, we have been able to agree somewhat on definitions, on numbers, percentages, and in this case, it seems like we haven't. But just as a layperson coming into this, if I imagine agriculture as an example, right? Like, why would we not be able, at least in a certain geography, say Europe, why would we not be able to agree on what residual emissions in agriculture could look like? And then the same logic applies to other sectors. But I still struggle to understand, what's really the hurdle here?
Yeah, I think there's a number of hurdles. So, the first one is really that this term did emerge out of this kind of, modeling community and in the IPCC reports. And so, again, a lot of the inputs into that process are very different to, say, the inputs that are relevant when, say, designing a corporate or company net zero strategy and whatnot. So there's this big divergence. And even within the formal academic literature, there is divergence definitions, and this is also based on divergent assumptions underpinning, what do we mean when we mean residual emissions? The first, big aspect of that is the timeline question. So, are we talking about residual emissions today based on today's technology, financial reality, and whatnot? Are we talking about 2030, 2050, or even, as far forward as we can hypothesize based on all that we know about technology to date? So that's why in sectors like agriculture, where perhaps the technology is, relatively mature, it might be easier to already grapple with what residual emissions are today and how they might evolve in a much more accurate manner. But for other sectors, that's not true. And I think another dimension that's really interesting as part of this is that it really, forces you to reconcile when we're talking about residual emissions. Are we talking about those that can't, technologically be abated? Or are we really talking about emissions that have had all types of mitigation mechanisms applied to it, including demand-side reduction? So for sectors such as aviation, the term residual emissions actually has embedded quite a lot of normative assumptions about what we are and are not willing to accept as society. So I think in such a ubiquitous term, one that we use and throw around a lot, actually it was a really interesting process to dig deeper into that and really show that there's much more divergence, not only in the formal sense and in terms of standards and how the academic literature has treated it, but really it raises these deep and fundamental questions, like most of climate policy does, about what we really value, both now and in the future.
I think there's another kind of facet to this whole concept, and that's I would say the political will to really define them, because we have the governments who basically under the Paris agreements can get to decide for themselves what the residual emissions are. Different types of stakeholders have their own interests, whether they want to see these as generous or flexible as possible or as limited as possible. So it has a lot of mixed interests. Hence, it's difficult to agree on something specific. But I think what would be also useful to clarify before we move forward is how the terms residual emissions and hard to abate emissions differ, because oftentimes they're used as synonyms, and this report makes it very clear that they are not synonyms. They mean different things. And maybe you can do a quick recap of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, really the clue is in the name, right? So hard to abate, we're talking about abatement. So we're talking about where technology simply doesn't exist to reduce an emissions source. And so, that really speaks to these technological limitations far more than, a diversity of range of choices, including things like demand side reduction, things like sectoral shifts, and perhaps, regulation as well. I mean, there's a number of different factors that really play into a really robust definition of residual emissions. We point to 13 different steps to which to determine residual emissions and assess them over time. And we do so because it is a really dynamic function that does require a lot more additional considerations than just the term hard to abate.
But for me, because the CDR industry, I mean, if I think about take voluntary standards, where you also talk about ISO and SBTi, right? And a lot of what happens today, what will happen in the early 2030s, is based on that projection, right? It's based on what will those residual emissions be 10, 20 years from now. It's pretty shocking to kind of see how divergent the opinions here are. And I remember when we did the show with Harry Smith on long-term strategies, which you also referenced in your report, right? And that was another example where he said they were wildly different numbers, which then translate into carbon removal targets, right? And actual policy that is instituted today to achieve those targets. And it's just wild. And I'm wondering, like, I know you focus kind of on a plan of how we can approach this. But I'm curious, is that also, that was focused, I felt a lot on kind of corporates. Can that be translated as well to governments who are trying to estimate these?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's similar to a lot of frameworks where the types of issues you're grappling with are very similar, whether you're a country or a corporate, especially when you're thinking about corporates with many different value chains within them too. I think what's really interesting is thinking through the quantitative dimension. So one aspect of the former SBTi framework, that tended to scare people was when residual emissions, or the kind of neutralization end of that, did have a quantitative percentage put on that. So say if we were looking at governments and saying you did have to reduce your emissions to 5 to 10%, that immediately starts introducing a number of trade-offs and and serious ones too. And so I think it would be a really interesting exercise to compare the NDCs and long-term strategies with the kinds of residual emissions / neutralization strategies that we're asking corporates to do, because it is a really fundamental exercise. Of course, the one kind of wrinkle in that extending that logic is these two are interlinked, right? The country and corporate ledgers is a bigger debate as well, and I think that would also necessarily come up when trying to extend this framework back to countries.
So one of the messages that I take from this report is that it's not actually a problem that we haven't defined it, and we potentially could have tools to tackle it in a meaningful way still. Which is great, because oftentimes this is brought up as if, as long as we haven't defined it, it's kind of holding us back from doing anything meaningful, and kind of turning it around and explain that is not necessarily the case. So how should we think about it? Clearly, you already said that that's something that it's not one fixed thing that will not change over time for different reasons. But so if a corporate would want to think about their residual emissions, how should they go about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one, when we were developing the report, we really did try to situate ourselves in that role as a corporate, really trying to grapple with this, especially having come from, the state of where the literature is at. We definitely appreciated that it's not an easy exercise. And so in the first instance, we really just wanted to stress that, again, it's not a monolith. It's really important to unpack the different strands involved in residual emissions and really focusing on, what do we know is near-term abatable? What do we have the technology to be able to deploy? It might not be deployed yet for various factors, but what do we know is definitely possible now? Then there's this kind of bucket of, the reductions that we think based on the planned technological innovations and technological readiness levels that we think could realistically be available, as we approach 2040. So that medium-term kind of target. And then looking beyond, then over the next 15 to 20 years and through to 2050, there's also some additional technological assumptions that we know exist today. But of course, these will all be revised and tested, over the coming decades. And so I think by distinguishing these three buckets, it at least, helps the corporate consider that they don't have to, put on their magic hat and gaze into a crystal ball to determine these residual emissions, that they can really connect it to, what their advisors are telling them about the technology and how it will track in the future. Of course, what's also important to consider is also not just these kinds of technological improvements and innovations, but really what it takes to neutralize those residual emissions, because of course it's a trade-off, and especially it does cost money to do that R&D, to develop that technology. So it can really help create that business case for really trying to tackle and nail down exactly what residual emissions look like in the near term, medium term, and long term, if we know the cost of neutralization, as the other option in this case, because it's really interesting, and this is why residual emissions is so critical to get right. When we look at the CDR gap, for instance, in essence, we're trying to build a bridge over a torrent of emissions that we really don't understand that well. What levers we have to restrict them, and it's really difficult to build a bridge without knowing how long that bridge has to be, of what kind of materials we need to make it. And so it really is quite a critical exercise, but at least looking at those two sides of the coin can help give a really accurate picture of carbon dependencies today, but also that impetus to really innovate as well in coming decades too.
Ask you about what I assume is that length of the bridge, which is something that I come back to often. The kind of economic how much you can economically justify reductions and at what point removals make more sense, right? I guess the way I come at this from is pretty simple, which is the moment that permanent removals with very strong MRV are cheaper than a reduction, we should be optimizing for removals. Period. That's just my person, but I know that's not necessarily how a lot of these frameworks are built. But how did you approach this in your report and in your own views?
Yeah, well, it was an interesting exercise again from trying to walk in the foot of a corporate, really, trying to tackle this issue. It was really important to consider, well, I mean, this does just differ so much sectorally because, corporates aren't, running out there isolated in the world or disconnected from rules and regulations. They will be operating, within the preconditions set by the Paris Agreement, and so have other jurisdictional matters to also consider. So, even if it does become cheaper to, permanently remove rather than abate an emission, they may be precluded from that exercise. And so this is also what's quite interesting about really appreciating all the different aspects that go into residual emissions is that legislative and regulatory layer, because there's good reasons why governments may not seek to ensure that outcome and to really ensure that we are still getting R&D, we're getting investment in a range of technological abatement opportunities, even if they are at a higher cost than permanent CDR. I think some of that is also a little bit more justified in light of there's varying mechanisms that we're also using currently now to try and build that long-term supply of CDR, but I think it's definitely a balancing exercise, and so that's why we spend the time in the report to really walk through kind of a sequence of how a corporate might approach this, all the way from distinguishing those categories of emissions we talked about between the near, medium, and the long term, really looking to actually develop a plan for each of those with the kind of information that is known. And of course, the rest of it, and we touched on this a little bit already, just recognizing how dynamic a baseline this is as an exercise. And so really being honest about them, being transparent. And through that transparency, I think you can also sow the seeds for a lot more collaborative innovation, for instance, including with government, when we have the options of tax credits and whatnot coming on the table for some purchases or for R&D type investments. So it's a complex blend, but I think, one, it is really important to address and at least to provide some practical steps that corporates or indeed governments could actually take now to really identify quite a strategic plan to address their residual emissions.
So since the report came out, we've had some news in the corporate climate governance world, where we have the SBTi standards version 2 net zero standard published, and the draft ISO standard also published. If you look at these and how they treat residual emissions, do you have some concerns?
I think it's interesting, and again, recognizing that at least the ISO standard is still in draft mode, right? So this is by no means final, but I think they do introduce some different dimensions into the equation. I mean, through SBTi, residual emissions do become a really important volume to identify because of these, like the progress that you have to make in terms of neutralization. And so, it is really important to understand exactly how corporates will be taking those steps to identify that volume. And then obviously the steps beyond that to actually then work towards 100% neutralization. So, I mean, and I think this a kind of treatment of residual emissions overall, and particularly those implications of residual emissions within the corporate net zero standard, really speaks to one of the biggest weaknesses overall in it, which is really still, leaving a lot of that real core of implementation, to future decades. And I think, this still creates a bit of a missed opportunity, which actually the ISO standard, again, cautious that it's in its draft form, actually can fill that gap a little bit more. So, that there's more requirements there to actually, make a plan to address your residual emissions. They recognize the roles of different pathways from a top-down perspective, the bottom-up kind of corporate or entity level assessment that's needed, and really also creates beyond that this kind of recognition of some kind of feasibility test. So it's really the first standard that I've seen that really does dive in with a lot more specificity about the kinds of factors that are at play when determining residual emissions. And through that kind of framework, I think that is a really good, entry point for organizations to determine these. And of course, one of the other innovations within that framework is that 5-year reassessment period. So really ensuring that pathway is assessed over time as well.
Because when I look at your framework, kind of the near term is very clear. The CDR bucket is very clear. The medium term is the one that I trip over a little bit, just because it's kind of the filler in the middle, but it also seems to leave there's a lot of unknowns in that medium bucket, basically, right? And there's a lot of assumptions about what technologies could look like 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And that in turn will probably lead to a lot of optimistic assumptions that corporates and governments will make, at least in my experience, on what technology will look like in that time frame, which in turn will reduce the need for CDR and potentially reduce the investments into CDR in the present. So I'm just wondering, how can we mitigate the risk of being too optimistic on that medium-term bucket?
I think it really is, it's down to the need to look at all three buckets and at the same time, because in essence, if you are too optimistic in your medium-term assumptions, those will ultimately become your near-term assumptions, closer than we think, but also, long-term assumptions as well. These are all a contained bucket, and I think there is one way to reduce the risk of overestimation is by having those regular check-ins and intervals, and clearly articulating. And this is something, we really see as a gap, not only concerning residual emissions, but broadly, offsetting strategies and whatnot. We see a lot about the actions that corporates are taking, but not a lot of justification and explanation about maybe the steps they aren't or the steps that they considered but didn't go through with for whatever reason. And I think it would be really helpful as part of these regular assessments of residual emissions to also ascertain what assumptions are meaning that some categories of emissions abatement technology is being put in the medium term or the long term. What would need to change in the landscape, for instance, cost coming under a certain threshold for an emissions category to shift. Again, this is very sector dependent, but I think all these kinds of exercise and this level of transparency would really go a long way, not only to ensuring that a given organization is responsibly deploying the framework, but also those broader signals back out to industry as well as to government are also clear, because again, coming back to these residual emissions aren't just, a problem within a given organization or country. They really are a collective endeavor. And I think that's also where it's interesting to, again, contrast, SBTI as a framework, because it is clear that cooperative lens in terms of that, scope 3 neutralization will also become really important. So I think, even beyond the substance of identifying residual emissions, we really need a lot of good process about, what is happening internally within organizations and what that means for the catalytic kind of environment that we need beyond that to both work on the emissions abatement technologies, as well considering demand side reduction in certain industries, but critically also to build out that durable carbon removal neutralization potential that we know we need as well.
How do the distribution and equity considerations fit into all of this? if at all, in your view? Because oftentimes, like when we look at the UNFCCC process, we know that the common and differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is a concept that keeps popping up a lot. But of course, it's difficult to implement in practice when it comes to residual emissions, because that's bottom up. But then the corporates we also see acting quite differently in carbon market space. Those who have more finances available do quite a bit. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I mean, this just lends itself to why it is so important to really unpack what we're meaning when we're talking about residual emissions, particularly where there are normative choices to be made, because it is the case that certain industries may be operational, be releasing a lot of residual emissions. But as a society, we've decided whether, because of the value they bring to a specific jurisdiction or population or whatnot, that essentially they have that social license to continue. That would mean trade-offs in other spaces. We know we have a very finite carbon budget to deal with. And so I think really surfacing some of the assumptions that are going into residual emissions, for instance, how many flights we might be taking by 2050, what will the dietary profiles of populations look like by then. Once we're surfacing some of those normative assumptions, we can really start to get to grips with, what choices do we have, both within societies, but also critically between countries. And I think we'll see a lot of that coming out, with the further development of Article 6, but also remembering that there's a number of different dimensions also wrapped into the Paris Agreement, including technological transfer. And I think it would be really interesting also to better work collectively on tackling residual emissions, both from that technological standpoint, but also from that societal net good standpoint as well.
I find one of the things that I find most interesting in this conversation were these kind of normative judgments that you mentioned. Just because I didn't have that on my radar. And I find it so strange that they would play a role here, because who is to decide whether we're going to fly less in 2050 or not? Who is to decide whether we're going to all switch to plant-based diets by 2050? And I'm sure the companies, like an aviation company, will definitely not be the one forecasting that flights will become less, right? So who's making these calls on the normative side?
Well, it's interesting because, what we found from this research is really, it's not that these normative calls will be needed in the future, it's that they're already in existence today, right? Even in determining a certain emission type as residual, at that net zero endpoint, we're already assuming that there'll be that demand at that point, and, that it does play a role, again, in a carbon constrained world still at that point. And so I think surfacing these normative assumptions, or at least that they have been occurring, is really critical as a first step. And then it really puts the onus on governments, but also just collectively with more cooperation also between corporates to really take ownership of that. And that's really where this call for transparency comes in, because if we see the kinds of factors that are going into these determinations of residual emissions, that is when we can really start to appreciate where there is societal trade-offs, and also where there may be industries that are still in existence that can't afford to neutralize all of their residual emissions. Is this a place where the government has to step up, to reach the Paris Agreement's balance between sinks and sources? Ultimately, that responsibility does come down to parties to the Paris Agreement. And so I think we will see more joining of the dots between these, what are now quite disparate worlds. And that is where some of these normative judgments will surface. But I think it's really critical that we understand that they're already in there. And again, I mean, if you are taking that example of the aviation sector, and we do see estimations of aviation emissions, at least doubling over the next century, we can start to really also then ascribe responsibility, on that same sector to identify exactly what those residual emissions are and the steps that are being taken to catalyze how they're going to be neutralized. And again, it's a government decision about whether those costs ultimately do fall within that same sector or whether they're distributed to the general economy. But, only through surfacing these kinds of underlying assumptions can we really, I think, come to terms with the whole of society choices that we need to make to reach that net zero end state.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Injy. It is a great report. I really recommend everyone to read it who want to understand better all these different considerations behind residual emissions and how to tackle these. I love that you came on and shared your take on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Injy.
Thank you. And just to give a teaser, we will be converting this into academic publications. So do look out for that. And of course, we're really interested to see, again, how these ongoing standards, SBTi, ISO, and GHG protocol also do actually continue to evolve to support more, clearer elucidations of what we are meaning when we're talking about residual emissions, and not just that, but what steps are actually happening now to address them. So thank you for the opportunity to dive deep into this today. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.